how do you know when you are having a really good class discussion? That's a deceptively simple question that has actually a fairly complex response. Many of us who've been teaching for a long time, we have kind of an intuition that we've developed, a sense of when a conversation or just a deep discussion or a debate is going well. We feel it in the room. We feed off the energy. We walk away from that class feeling motivated and energized about our work. But what exactly is it in that classroom that we look for, that we sense, that we pick up on, that tells us we're having a really good class discussion? I've been asking faculty members this question for many years, and the responses generally fall into one of three categories. And the first category I would call volume. Simply, a lot of students talk, or a lot of students talk a lot, right? Just that there's a lot of good conversation happening. The second category that I get responses in is what I would call sort of distribution. How many of the students are speaking? Is it most of them, all of them? But also the distribution would be to whom, right? Is it all going through the instructor, or is it student to student? What is the nature or the directionality of that engagement? And finally, a third category is quality, or the content of the discussion, where they take it, how deeply they engage with the material, whether they reach the learning outcomes the instructor has desired for that discussion, right? But this is a little bit more elusive because often, as we all know, good conversations go in directions that are unexpected. So even with those responses, what if I change the question? Instead of asking you how you know if you're having a good class discussion, what if I asked you, how would you demonstrate to someone else that you are good at facilitating these kinds of discussions, that your classroom is a site of lively engagement? Again, it sounds like a pretty simple question, but we lack in many ways the ability to make visible the often invisible work of classroom engagement. This is where classroom mapping has evolved as a tool, as a process for making the directionality, the volume, the content, the nature of how you engage your students in the classroom visible. And we make that visible, well, for a number of reasons. So what I'm going to do in this video is walk you through a couple of different maps. We're going to see a story of the interaction between student, instructor, and space unfold so that you can get a sense of what classroom maps do, what they can show you, and the various purposes they might be able to serve. So here's our classroom. Let me start with a simple demonstration of what a classroom map can show you. What you're seeing now is our classroom. Those are the students, and this is the furniture. So imagine that this is the instructor, and the instructor is now going to engage the students in a class discussion. What will happen every time the instructor speaks, you'll see an arrow appear between the instructor and a student who responds to that prompt. The arrows are the classroom map. They're showing the directionality, who's speaking to who, within a particular classroom space. So in this example, the instructor, wasn't too pleased with the pattern of engagement he was seeing in this classroom. So he chose to rearrange the space in his classroom to see if perhaps that would evoke more engagement from his students. So now what you see is our classroom has been rearranged, and here are the patterns of engagement that came from that. Ask yourself for a moment, what do you think? Did changing the space change anything about the engagement in his classroom? Did it improve or enhance classroom engagement? Most of you will probably say, not really. We still have a lot of instructor-student interaction, not a lot of student-to-student interaction. We have approximately the same distribution or directionality as well. We may not know if that's the same students, but overall pattern of engagement is roughly similar even in the redesigned classroom. But let's look at the third chapter of this story. In this last map, the instructor, instead of just changing the space, he changes his approach to how he asks the questions. And here now you can see on the map, hopefully, that by changing the pedagogy, he's changed the patterns of engagement in his class. And the evidence of that improved engagement is visible in the arrows on the map. And that simply is exactly what a classroom map is supposed to do. It's not just about space, but it's about how space interplays and plays out between the student learning and the teaching that the instructor is doing. It gives you a portrait, a snapshot of that dynamism that is taking place inside the classroom. All right, so now you've got the basics. Let's add another layer of meaning or interpretation to the classroom mapping process. Here's our classroom again. And now what you're going to see unfolding is a whole class discussion, where the instructor yet again is leading the class in discussion and asking questions. You can watch as that conversation, that dialogue evolves over time. What we've added here, and this is where a lot of the new technologies, the new software programs that do classroom mapping have provided for us, is we can now get, in addition to directionality, now we can get volume. The thicker lines you see now that the conversation, the class discussion has ended, that shows more engagement, longer engagement, more volume of engagement between the particular student and the instructor. So just to reiterate, thinner lines mean there was less engagement between, in this case, between the instructor and the student, and the thicker lines mean there was more. And so you should be able to take a look at a map like this one and get a sense not just of who's talking, but how much they're talking and how much they're engaging and with who. All right, so we've got you that far. Let's add another layer. So what you see happening in our classroom now gets a little bit more complicated. So again, we see the lines that showed both directionality and volume. But in this case, the patterns are a little bit more complex. In our classroom, this is about 20 minutes into a particular class. What I'm going to invite you to do is take a look at this map. It takes some time to train your eye to be able to interpret the maps. And take a look and see what you see happening in this classroom. How would you characterize the engagement that's going on here? By looking at the patterns of engagement, can you identify what you think the pedagogical approach is that this particular instructor is using? And in this case, we really start to illustrate one of the primary purposes of classroom mapping, and that is formative assessment. In other words, it acts like feedback to the instructor. If you want to get a sense of engagement in your classroom beyond sort of what your intuition tells you, this shows you a map of it. It makes visible that work so you can see it and think about it and say, hey, is this the pattern of engagement I'm hoping for or aspire for in my course? And if it isn't, what could I do about that? So with that in mind, I invite you to say not only what engagement you see, not only what pedagogical strategy you see this professor using, but also if this were your colleague, or even if this were your own course, what advice would you give that colleague? What insight would you give yourself? There are a lot of layers of meaning that can be intuited and analyzed and interpreted from the lines on this classroom map. Some of the common insights I hear when I give this particular workshop is that this pattern appears to be suggestive that there is kind of a debate going on in this class, right? There are potentially contentious issues about which some people feel very passionately, hence that those long, thicker lines of interaction with some of the students. But the other thing folks notice is how the students are clustered in space and how that clustering seems to be impacting the instruction that's taking place. And if you're not familiar, this is an old teaching technique known as a fishbowl exercise, where when organizing a debate, you have students take turns in the middle of the classroom with the fishbowl, and those students then ask questions and project outwards from the fishbowl to other students in the class. I chose this example because that's particularly visual, that style of pedagogy, but you can also see other styles of pedagogy within maps. Think about your own instruction and any active learning techniques you use. and what visual traces they might leave behind. And the question for this particular map that comes up a lot is, of course, not everybody's participating. And when this process of classroom mapping first evolved, it was often done for equity purposes. So professors could know if they were, unintentionally, I presume, leaving students out of conversations. But now we have a more sophisticated view of that. And so it's not necessary that every student necessarily has to engage every time. But it may be worth a point reflecting why some students seem to be engaged on this topic and some others clearly are not. So we've watched our classroom evolve, and we've watched the mapping of the engagement in that classroom evolve. And now here we're going to add a few more layers to the map. As you can see, now our students have apparent genders. And we do apologize for any gender stereotyping in the avatars. We also, by the colors, by other things, we can see other attributes. We can add variables to the map, like race and ethnicity, but power, like space. Whatever attributes you want to put into the software, you can add to your classroom map. And you can add layers, dimensions to the engagement patterns that take place in your class. And this allows us to see more deeply, to provide more insight into what's maybe happening. We'll pause the mapping process here again, but you see this is after approximately 60 minutes, how our classroom has evolved. And now we can look to see if some of the patterns that we're seeing from the start with the whole group discussion to the fishbowl exercise to this small group exercise. The question I would ask you, again, would be, how would you characterize the engagement that's taking place now? What additional levers of explanation or layers of explanation do we get by adding some of these other variables, like gender, like race and ethnicity? What story is this map now telling about this classroom, this instructor, and this space? What happens when we put all these layers together? So I don't have any easy answers or pat interpretations of this last map. And precisely because engagement is complex, the reason students choose to engage, how they choose to engage, the mapping process currently focuses largely on observable behavior. And we now have a much more nuanced idea of engagement that's not, of course, the only way students engage in the learning process in a classroom. So there are definitely limitations. But what else can we learn? What other variables might we add that would provide us with insights that we can only have if we make the previously invisible, often private, often ephemeral work of classroom engagement visible in the form of maps? There are a number of software tools out there now in the market space that give you the ability to make these maps, to use them as both formative assessment, to use them as a way to reflect on your own instruction and your own engagement. And of course, you can use them to reflect with students as well. We consider that a best practice to share the maps with your students. But now we're also starting to get into the idea that these could possibly be used for research purposes beyond formative assessment. The increasing sophistication of the classroom mapping tools gives us not only more fodder for reflection, but also for research. It's possible that these lines then become numbers that can then become measured, that can then feed into things like social network analysis, or even potentially bubble up to the level of learning analytic. These tools are not without their limitations, and there should be privacy discussions. And if you'd like to use one of these software tools, some of them are open source, some of them are very inexpensive. I would encourage you to talk to your ethical review board first. Anytime you're doing classroom observation, want to be cognizant of ethics, but also what kinds of data these tools collect is also something your institution may want to think through with you. But also, of course, you can just do it the old-fashioned way on a piece of paper, and that will still function to make those lines of engagement that you intuit as an instructor visible for us to consider what can we do with that? Where can we take that? What happens when we make engagement visible? What are the possibilities?